2 days before Christmas, my son called and said something that took the air out of my lungs. "Look, Dad, my wife thinks it's better if you skip this one. The kids barely know you. It would just be awkward for everyone." So I spent Christmas Eve alone at a diner in Knoxville, Tennessee, staring at a cup of coffee that kept getting cold. A woman sitting 2 tables over noticed I was alone. I thought it was just a small kindness, the kind strangers offer and then forget. I had no idea that one moment was about to divide my life into two completely different stories. 3 years later, my son stood at the edge of his daughter's graduation party and watched me with people who called me family. And I finally understood that losing him had been the beginning of something, not the end. My name is Gerald Hutchins. I am 63 years old, and I have spent most of those years believing that if I just tried hard enough, worked hard enough, showed up enough times, I could earn a place in my own son's life. I was wrong about that for a very long time. I had retired from 31 years as a high school shop teacher in Knoxville. It wasn't a glamorous career. I taught kids how to use a table saw without losing a finger, how to measure twice and cut once, how to take raw wood and build something that would last. I was good at it. The classroom was the one place where I always knew my role, always knew where I stood. My marriage had ended 11 years earlier. My ex-wife and I had simply grown into two different people who didn't know how to live in the same house anymore. There was no affair, no great betrayal, just a long, quiet erosion. My son was 26 when we divorced, old enough that it shouldn't have mattered the way it did, but it mattered to him. And in the years that followed, I watched him carry that resentment the way some men carry a grudge, close to the chest, carefully, like something they're afraid to put down. His wife had never liked me. I don't say that with bitterness, it's simply a fact I spent too many years trying to disprove. She was polite in the way that people are polite when they're managing their tolerance. She called me by my first name even when her own parents were mom and dad to my son. She made decisions about holidays and family gatherings and where my son spent his time, and she did it so smoothly that I spent years wondering if it was really happening or if I was imagining things. My daughter, Emma, was different. She had always been the one who called on birthdays without being reminded, who drove 4 hours on a Tuesday when my back went out and I couldn't reach the top shelf of my own pantry. She had her own life, a job in Asheville she was proud of, friends I liked when I met them. She was the thread that kept me connected to the idea of family, even when my son made it feel like something I no longer had access to. The Christmas call came on December 23rd. I was wrapping a wooden toy chest I had built in my garage over the past 6 weeks. It was for my granddaughter, who had just turned 4. I had sanded it by hand, stained it a soft walnut brown, painted her name on the front in careful block letters. I had been planning to drive it up to their house in Chattanooga the next morning. My son's voice on the phone was measured, rehearsed in the way it always was when his wife had coached him through what to say. "Look, Dad, this year has been really hectic. The holidays are stressful enough, and Claire just thinks it would be better if we kept it small. Family only." I started to say that I was family. He talked over me, not loudly, just firmly enough that I understood the conversation was already over before it had begun. "The kids barely know you, Dad. I don't want them to feel uncomfortable. It would just be awkward. We'll figure out another time." I stood in my garage holding my phone after he hung up. The toy chest sat on my workbench under the overhead light. My granddaughter's name painted in letters I had gone over twice to make sure they were straight. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for my coffee to go cold. Long enough for the garage to feel very large and very quiet. I called Emma that evening. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I loved most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Dad," she said carefully, "that wasn't okay. What he said wasn't okay." I told her I knew that. She asked what I was going to do. I told her I was going out for coffee. She said she was proud of me for not just sitting alone in the house. I didn't tell her that sitting alone in the house had been my first plan, and the coffee was a last-minute act of self-preservation. The diner was called Millie's, and it had been on that corner of Kingston Pike for longer than I'd lived in Knoxville. It had the kind of lighting that made everything look slightly golden, and the kind of coffee that came in a pot that never quite emptied. I sat at a 2-person table by the window and watched the parking lot, and thought about nothing in particular. The woman who changed everything was named Dorothy Weston. She was 71 years old, though I didn't know that at the time. She had silver hair pulled back loosely and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she was sitting 2 tables over with her husband, Frank, and a table so covered in food that it was clear they had ordered for more people than had arrived. When she looked over and caught me looking at nothing, she smiled in that direct, unhurried way that some older women have, the kind of smile that doesn't ask anything of you. She stood up before I fully registered what was happening, walked the 8 feet between our tables like it was perfectly natural, pulled out the chair across from me without being invited, said, "My family is clearly not coming, and you clearly have nowhere to be, so why don't you come sit with us?" I almost said no. Old habit. I'm fine. Thank you. Don't trouble yourself. But I looked at her face, and then at Frank across the room, who raised his hand in something between a wave and a salute, and something in me that had been clenched since my son's phone call just let go. "Okay," I said. "Thank you." Frank Weston had been a high school principal for 22 years. He and Dorothy had been married for 46 years. They had 2 adult children and 4 grandchildren, 2 of whom had been supposed to join them for dinner but had canceled with some excuse involving traffic and a work emergency that Dorothy clearly didn't entirely believe. She told me all of this within the first 10 minutes, with the candor of someone who had decided that small talk was for people who had more time than she did. We talked for 2 hours. Frank asked about my career and listened with genuine interest. Dorothy asked about my granddaughter and didn't blink when I explained that I wouldn't be seeing her that Christmas. She just nodded and said, "Children make hard choices sometimes. Sometimes it's them. Sometimes it's someone whispering in their ear." And then she moved on and asked me what I'd been working on in my garage. And we spent 20 minutes talking about woodworking, during which Frank turned out to have opinions I hadn't expected. When the diner started dimming its lights at 10:30, Dorothy reached into her purse and pulled out a pen and wrote something on the back of a receipt. She slid it across the table to me. "We have people over every Sunday after church. Nothing formal. Just too much food and not enough conversation with people who aren't blood relatives. You should come. Sunday at 2. The address is on there." I took the paper and folded it and put it in my shirt pocket because it felt like something I shouldn't put in my wallet and risk forgetting. I drove home that night thinking about the way Dorothy had stood up and walked over to my table. No hesitation, no complicated weighing of social protocol, just a woman who saw someone sitting alone on Christmas Eve and decided to do something about it. I spent Christmas Day with Emma, who drove up from Asheville. She brought a pie and a bottle of wine, and we sat in my kitchen talking until midnight. I told her about Dorothy and Frank. She smiled in the way she did when something genuinely pleased her. "That's the universe, Dad," she said. "That's what the universe does when you stop looking in the wrong direction." The following Sunday, I drove to the address on the receipt. I sat in my car outside for 11 minutes. The house was a brick ranch in a quiet neighborhood east of downtown. Warm light in every window, cars in the driveway and along the curb. I almost left twice. What finally got me out of the car was the memory of sitting alone in my garage holding my phone, and the decision I had made in that moment that I was not going to let that be the only story I had. Dorothy opened the door before I knocked, the way people do when they've been watching for someone. "Gerald," she said, like my arrival was the most natural thing. Come in. Come in. Frank's arguing about football with my son-in-law. You should probably take his side, whatever it is." What followed was something I can only describe as being absorbed. Not in an overwhelming way. Not in a way that asked anything of me. Just slowly, steadily, week by week, the Weston family made a place for me the way a body makes room for something it has decided to keep. Frank and I started having coffee on Saturday mornings before the Sunday gatherings. Dorothy started texting me pictures of birds that landed in their backyard, which she knew interested me because I had mentioned it once in passing. Their granddaughter, Lily, who was 7, decided I was her particular project and spent 6 weeks teaching me a card game whose rules changed every time she dealt. By March, I had a standing chair at the Sunday table, the one by the window that got the most light. By April, Dorothy had started leaving out a coffee mug with my name on a piece of tape on the bottom. By May, Frank had asked me to help him build a raised garden bed in the backyard, and we had spent 3 weekends doing it. and the conversation had been easy and unhurried the way I had forgotten conversations could be. I called Emma after every Sunday dinner. She listened to me describe the Westons with what I could hear was quiet relief. "You sound different," she told me one evening. "Lighter, like you remembered something you'd been trying to remember for a long time." I told her I thought I knew what she meant. The call from my son came in April, 4 months after Christmas. I was in the Weston backyard helping Frank measure the garden bed when my phone rang. I stepped away and answered because I always answered, even when part of me knew I should wait. My son's voice had that particular quality again. The one I had learned over 30 years meant he was steering towards something. "How are you, Dad?" "Fine," I said. "Good, actually." There was a short pause. "Good. That's good." He asked about my retirement, about Emma, about a few things that had nothing to do with why he was calling. And I let him work his way toward it because I already knew where we were going. It came after about 8 minutes. "Rebecca and I have been looking at refinancing the house, and we want to do some renovations at the same time. Kitchen, master bath. The contractor, quote, came in higher than we expected." "Dad, I was thinking, since you sold the house in Maryville, you have some money sitting. 40,000 would cover the gap." I walked to the far end of the garden while Frank kept working and pretended not to hear. "I don't think I can do that," I said. He started in before I finished the sentence. "You don't think you can? Or you won't?" I said both. He said he thought I was being punitive, that I was punishing him for Christmas, that this wasn't about the money, it was about me holding a grudge. I let him finish. Then I said, "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm just not going to give you $40,000 for a kitchen renovation." He got quieter, which was always more dangerous than his anger. "Dad," he said, "Rebecca and I are trying to build a stable home for your grandchildren. The least you could do is support that." I thought about the toy chest in my garage with my granddaughter's name painted on it, still sitting on the workbench because I hadn't known how to get it to her. I thought about Christmas Eve at Millie's diner. I thought about Dorothy walking over to my table without being invited. "I support my grandchildren," I said. "I'd love to be more present in their lives, if that were something their parents wanted. But I'm not going to write a check to prove that I care. That's not what caring is." He said something sharp and then he pulled back from it, the way he did when he was catching himself. He said he just thought family helped family. I said I agreed completely. Then we were both quiet for a moment. "When you're ready to talk about what's actually happening between us," I said, "I'm here for that. But I'm not going to keep confusing money with connection. It hasn't worked for 11 years, and it won't work now." He said he had to go, and he hung up. I stood at the edge of the garden bed, Frank had measured perfectly, and watched the early spring light on the new dirt. Frank appeared beside me. "You okay?" I told him what had happened. He nodded slowly. "He's using the only lever he thinks he has," Frank said. "He doesn't know you've changed. He's still pulling at the version of you that you used to be." That night I called Emma. She cried a little, which she did when something hurt her even if it wasn't hurting her directly. "Dad," she said, "you did the right thing." "I know," I said, and I meant it in a way I hadn't the last time I'd said those words. I wasn't convincing myself. I just knew. The months that followed were the quietest of my life, in the best possible way. My son didn't call. I didn't reach out. The silence between us settled like weather. Permanent feeling, but not actually permanent. I stopped checking my phone for messages from him the way I used to. I stopped doing the arithmetic of his absences, counting the weeks since we'd spoken, looking for a number that would tell me something meaningful. Instead, I spent Saturday mornings with Frank. I spent Sunday afternoons with the Westons. I drove to Asheville twice to see Emma and met her partner, a landscape architect named Daniel, who shook my hand like he meant it and asked me about woodworking for 45 minutes because he was genuinely interested. I started building things in my garage again, not for anyone specific, just for the pleasure of it. A small bench, a set of shelves, a rocking chair that took me 8 weeks and came out better than I expected. Dorothy noticed the rocking chair when I brought it over to show them. She sat in it on their porch and said it was the most comfortable thing she'd ever been in, and Frank immediately said he wanted one too, and that started a 6-month project that gave me something to look forward to every weekend. Lily, who was now 8, decided that I was her grandfather, not in a formal announced way. She simply started calling me Grandpa Gerald one afternoon, and nobody corrected her, including me. The word landed somewhere in my chest and stayed there. I hadn't expected to earn it. I hadn't expected to earn any of this. But I had learned something over those months that I hadn't known before, or maybe had known and forgotten. Love that is freely given feels different from love that you've had to negotiate for. It sits differently. It doesn't make the same noise in the night. My son's daughter was graduating from 8th grade in June. I knew about it because Emma told me, carefully, the way she handled information about his life. She had stayed in contact with him, which was her choice to make, and I respected it even when it was hard. She asked me once if I wanted her to pass along a message. I told her to tell him I was well and that I'd be glad to hear from him when he was ready. She said she would. I didn't know if she did. Emma called me 2 weeks before the graduation. "Dad," she said, "I need to tell you something." She had been invited to the graduation party, and she had told my son she was bringing me. She said it carefully, the way she always did when she was delivering something complicated. "I didn't ask her first," she said. "I should have, but I needed him to see you. I needed him to understand what he's been missing. I know that was my decision to make and not yours." But I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, "Did he say I could come?" Emma said he hadn't said I couldn't, which meant his wife hadn't vetoed it yet, or hadn't been consulted, or Emma had moved fast enough that there hadn't been time for the usual process. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked her. She said she'd never been more sure of anything. I wore a sport coat I'd bought in March and hadn't had occasion to use yet. Frank told me I looked like a man who knew where he was going. Dorothy hugged me at the door when I stopped to say hello to them on the way out, even though it was a Wednesday and not Sunday. She held my face in her hands for a moment the way she did sometimes, a gesture so direct it had taken me weeks to stop flinching from it. "You call me after," she said. I told her I would. The party was at their house in Chattanooga, a backyard gathering with a rented tent and string lights. Emma met me in the driveway. She looked at me with the expression she got when she was trying to hold herself steady. "Dad," she said, "you look good." I told her she looked better. We walked in together. My granddaughter found me before I found her. She was 12 now, taller than I had expected, with her mother's eyes and the way of carrying herself that I recognized as her father's from a long time ago. She came around the edge of a group of adults and stopped in front of me and said, "Are you my Grandpa Gerald?" I looked at Emma. Emma looked at her shoes. I said, "I'm your Grandpa Gerald." She said, "Mom didn't tell me you were coming." Then she hugged me. A real hug, unself-conscious. The kind children give before they learn to make them smaller for the sake of other people's comfort. I held on for an extra second. When I looked up, my son was standing across the yard watching us. He looked older than I'd expected, though I wasn't sure why I was surprised. 11 years since the divorce. 3 years since Christmas Eve at Millie's diner. He looked like a man who had been working hard at something and was tired in a way he hadn't admitted yet. His wife was beside him, and she looked at me the way she always had, with a careful neutrality that was its own kind of message. My granddaughter pulled back and said she had to go take pictures with her friends, but that she wanted to show me her graduation dress later. I said I would be there. She ran back into the crowd and I watched her go and tried to memorize the feeling of that hug. Emma appeared at my elbow. "That was unexpected," she said quietly. "I think you have an ally," I said. The party moved the way parties do. Conversation flowing from group to group, children chasing each other across the grass, adults standing in the particular configurations of families trying to be comfortable. I talked to people I didn't know and they asked the usual questions, and I answered them honestly. I ate something I didn't taste. I watched my granddaughter from across the yard and felt the years of absence with a clarity that was almost physical. My son found me near the food table about an hour into the party. He stood beside me and looked out at the yard and said, "You came." I said, "Emma invited me." He said, "I know." We stood there for a moment the way men do when they're looking for an entrance into a conversation neither of them knows how to start. "I didn't know you were going to be here," he said finally. "Emma didn't tell me until yesterday," I said. She told me she wanted you to see me. He was quiet. Then he said, "You look good, Dad." I told him he did too. He said he wasn't sure that was true. And there was something under the words, something worn and honest that I hadn't heard from him in a very long time. "I didn't know things were that bad," I said carefully. He looked at me. "The investment," I said. "The renovation." He let out a breath. "No," he said. "I guess I made it sound more specific than it was. It's been a hard couple of years. Rebecca and I have been—" He stopped. "We've been struggling." I said I was sorry to hear that. I meant it. He looked at his daughter across the yard, posing for pictures with a group of girls in matching sashes. "She's incredible," he said. "She really is." I agreed. "I told you," he said, and his voice was quiet, "that she barely knew you. But that's not entirely true, is it?" I said. "She recognized me." He was quiet for a moment. "Emma must have shown her pictures," he said. "She talks about you." He paused. "She asked me last month why Grandpa Gerald doesn't come to things. I didn't know what to tell her. I waited." He was standing at an edge of something, and I had learned not to push people off their own edges, only to stand nearby in case they needed something solid to grab. "I was wrong," he said. "About Christmas. About—" He paused. "About a lot of things. I should have pushed back. Rebecca has strong feelings about things, and I've let that become an excuse." He stopped. "I'm not saying this well." "I know," I said. He said, "I don't know how to fix it." I said, "I don't know either. But I think the fact that we're standing here talking is probably step one." He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was much younger, before the divorce, before the distance. He looked uncertain in the way people look when they are genuinely uncertain and not performing it. "I'm sorry I told you not to come for Christmas," he said. 3 years ago. "I'm sorry I said what I said about the kids not knowing you." He paused. "I think I said it because Rebecca—" And then he stopped again, and I could see him deciding not to finish that sentence. "I said it, and it wasn't right." I said, "I appreciate you saying that. I meant it the way I meant it when I told him I was sorry about his marriage, plainly, without territory attached to it." He nodded. He said he should probably get back to the other guests. I said, "Of course." He took 2 steps and then turned back. "I put that toy chest in her room," he said. "The one you built her. She sleeps with the lid open so she can see her name." I couldn't speak for a moment. "Good," I said. "I'm glad." He walked back across the yard, and I stood at the food table for a moment alone with everything I was feeling, which was too large and too complicated to organize. Emma appeared and handed me a cup of lemonade and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. My granddaughter found me again near the end of the party. She showed me her dress and told me about her graduation ceremony and about the summer reading list she was already planning to ignore. I told her I had built a rocking chair this year, and she asked if I would build one for her room. I said I would. She asked if I would teach her. I said absolutely, if her parents were agreeable. She said she would handle her parents. She said it the way children say things they mean entirely, without understanding how large the promise is. I believed her. I drove back to Knoxville with the windows down and the June air moving through the car. I thought about my son standing beside me at the food table, working his way toward something honest. I thought about my granddaughter's hug. I thought about Emma watching from across the yard with careful eyes. I thought about how much had happened in 3 years that I couldn't have predicted on Christmas Eve, sitting alone with a cold cup of coffee at Millie's diner. I stopped at the Westons on the way home even though it was a Thursday evening and not Sunday. Dorothy opened the door and looked at my face and said, "Come in." She put tea on without asking. Frank came in from the backyard where he'd been doing something with the garden bed we'd built, and he sat across from me and listened while I told them everything. Lily came downstairs in pajamas and climbed into the chair beside me and leaned against my arm the way she did, like it was simply where she belonged. Dorothy put a hand over mine on the table. Frank said, "That's the thing about setting boundaries. They don't always end things. Sometimes they create enough space for something to grow." I thought about that the whole drive home. I thought about the version of myself that had spent years trying to make himself small enough to fit through whatever door my son had left open. I thought about what it had cost me. That smallness. Not just the Christmas Eve alone. Not just the years of waiting for a call that didn't come. but the daily erosion of believing that love was something you earned through sufficient suffering. I thought about Dorothy walking 8 feet across a diner to sit at a stranger's table. No hesitation. Just a decision made by a person who understood something I had been slowly learning. That kindness is a choice. That belonging is a choice. That family is not something that happens to you. It is something you build and something you accept and something you choose over and over again on ordinary Sundays when there's too much food and not enough conversation. My son called me on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the graduation party. No preamble, no warmth up, just his voice saying, "Dad, my daughter wants to learn woodworking. She's been asking every day. I think she means it." I laughed. The kind of laugh that comes out before you can shape it into anything more composed. I said, "She told me she was going to handle her parents." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Apparently she did." There was something in his voice I hadn't heard in a long time. Something almost like humor. We talked for 20 minutes. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't the resolution of everything that had gone wrong between us. It was a phone call between two people who were trying to find out if there was still something worth finding. I told him that. He said he thought there might be. I said I would be willing to try if he was. He said he would try. He said Rebecca wasn't sure about everything, that there were still things to work through, that he understood if I needed time. I told him I didn't need time. I told him I just needed honesty. I still go to the Westons every Sunday. That part of my life is not provisional, not contingent on anything. Dorothy still texts me pictures of birds. Frank still argues about football with a conviction I find entirely unreasonable. Lily, who turned 9 last month, has informed me that she would like to enter the rocking chair I built in a school woodworking competition, and would I help her make one of her own. I said yes. She said she already knew I would. Emma came to visit last month and sat at the Weston Sunday table and fit in so completely that Dorothy told her she was welcome every week, and Emma said she might take her up on that. I built a small jewelry box for my granddaughter, maple with a cedar lining, her initials carved into the lid. I left space for her name when she's older and might have a different one. I wrapped it carefully and left it with Emma, who delivered it on a weekend visit. She texted me afterward. "Dad," she cried, "she's going to keep it forever." That night I sat on my porch and listened to the evening settle into quiet and thought about everything that had led to this moment. Not the pain of it, not the years of waiting, but the particular Tuesday evening when I had walked out of my garage and into a car and driven to Millie's diner instead of sitting alone in the dark. That decision, which had seemed so small, which had felt at the time like the last thing I had enough dignity to do, that decision had been the one that mattered. Family is not blood, and it is not obligation, and it is not the accumulated weight of everything people owe each other. Family is Dorothy standing up from her table without being asked. Family is Frank listening on a Saturday morning without needing to fix anything. Family is Lily leaning against your arm like you are simply where she belongs. Family is Emma calling on a Tuesday for no reason except that she wanted to hear your voice. And maybe, slowly, carefully, with honesty on both sides and no more confusion between money and love, maybe it is also a son who is starting to understand what he almost lost, and a granddaughter who sleeps with a toy chest open so she can see her name in letters her grandfather painted twice to make sure they were straight. I am 63 years old. I spent too many years believing that belonging was something other people had, something I had forfeited through the failure of my marriage and the distance between me and my son. I was wrong about that. I know that now, the way I know the weight of good wood in my hands, the way I know when a joint is true. It's not something I think, it's something I feel all the way through. If you're still listening, leave me a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from. And if this story touched something in you, something you've been carrying without quite knowing how to set it down, I want you to know that I understand. And I want you to know that it's not too late. It was not too late for me. And it is not too late for you. The invitation is still out there. Sometimes, you just have to drive to the diner,